All right. All right, it's 5:45. Let's get started, guys. So first of all, thank you to everyone for actually joining us today, this evening on Friday. We have two talks today. I'm starting with the first one, and then Anirudh here is going to do the second talk, as you must have seen in the agenda. Um, so I'm going to do, here's my agenda. I'm going to do a quick intro, then just mention a few words about progress. And then the three things I really want to talk about is specialization in society and how it has impacted progress. This one area I've been very interested for a long time and researching about, and I want to share my thoughts around that. The other thing is an experiment I did at work in terms of hacking progress, and this is more around the speed and productivity aspect of progress. And finally, I want to end with making a case for needing better tooling for intelligence augmentation. And I think that's a key pillar in order for us to get progress. I think most people who are here today have already been on the Progress Study Slack channel or the community that we have formed here in SF. For the people who are new, I'll do a quick little intro and then just dive into the material. So in terms of, let's see, my clicker's not working. All right, I'm just going to use this. All right, so the quick intro. So my name is Abhi. I'm a founding engineer and head of analytics and machine learning at a company called Foghorn Systems. What I do there is mostly compiler infrastructure and a machine learning runtime. I'm also a tech advisor at Unusual Ventures, which is actually hosting this event. So you can thank them for the food and the drinks and the space. And a quick word about Unusual Ventures is we are a seed and Series A focused venture firm. And the core competency around Unusual is literally being providing hands-on help around go-to-market sales and really walking the founder's journey with them. So you should check it out. The only one house rule I have is, we've actually, so this space we have is a company called Harness. Unusual has been kind enough to let us have the food and drinks. So please be respectful of the space and time. Um, so context for people who probably are here for the first time. So there's a whole group of community that got started and sort of self-organized themselves in SF and across the world around progress studies. And Patrick Collison and Tyler Cowen published this article in The Atlantic, which is like, we need a calling for a new science to figure out how we can measure progress better. And sort of that galvanized the moment around studying progress. And we're discussing everything from history, how we've come and made progress so far as a society, execution efficiency in startups and all kinds of things. And if you're interested, there's actually a Slack group about progress studies that is public and you guys can join. Now, I want to say a few quick words around progress and then sort of dive into the main things that I want to talk about. So those who are new, I think, and this chart was presented when we actually did our first meetup, and it's sort of highly abused, but if you've not seen this before, I think, and if this doesn't motivate and inspire you, then I'm not sure what will, because if you look at the amount of work and improvement that we've made as a human society over time, whether it's child mortality, whether it's democracy, whether it's literacy, we've really made a big dent in terms of making progress as a society. In fact, I just read an article a couple of days ago where we have almost eradicated polio. There are like 250 cases left across the world. And that's a huge achievement as a race in terms of progress. I mean, even simple things like when you open the tap and get hot water is progress, according to me. So I hope that this one slide convinces you that we should care about progress, that it's real, and that making progress and optimizing it is actually useful. And hopefully that's why we're here. Now, the structure that I like to think about is one of the other reasons coming from a very personal micro framework is that progress is useful and we should care about it because it fits both the macro and the micro perspective, as I call it. And it is a place where we can get people to talk about meaningful stuff. They might disagree on how to make the progress, but at least we all agree and come together on progress is important for us. And when I say macro, I mean when you talk about things like GDP, economics, society, well, both of these things fit. We want more innovation, we want new invention, and we want it faster. So the speed and productivity aspect fits there. And if you look at a micro perspective, which is an individual almost, then whatever work that you're doing, whether you're researching, whether you're learning something new, whether you're finishing up your task, you want to be creative in your task and you want to make progress faster. So the speed and innovation, sort of the two aspects or pillars of progress, fit there as well. So I really like to think about it in this way, because it really is talking about progress is exciting to me, because it really is a thing that can bring people together in terms of both perspectives around macro and micro. And I want to make a quick general position of what I have around progress before I dive in. Is in general, people ask me, like, how do you define progress? What do you think about it? And my take is, it's something where, as broad as you want more of the good stuff, more of the chart that I showed in the beginning, and how we can draw more charts like that, and say as a society and a race we've had all these interesting things. And second is, think of progress as an applied discipline, meaning it's not philosophy. We're not doing history for the sake of it. It's something empirical, where we have an objective of getting better at stuff as a society. And we want to optimize and empirically measure that and use those things within our community. And then finally, and there's been some disagreement about this, at least in the progress community, but I strongly believe it's something that's optimized on the inputs, but really measured if we are making progress or not on its outputs, not necessarily on the inputs. Meaning, you're working really hard, but you're not getting anything done. Well, that's not progress. Just working hard is not good enough. We need to be able to have economic progress, societal progress, and stuff like that. So setting that, I think I want to summarize that so far we've talked about why should we care about progress and sort of my general opinion around that. And the topic I really want to discuss, having set that context, because some people are new and here for the first time around progress studies, is specialization and how does it correlate to progress. And when I say specialization, what I mean is this hyper specialized society that we are becoming, where our skills, where our knowledge is super specialized. And how does that relate to progress? And that's what I mean in terms of human skill set or knowledge or domain specialization. And although I talked about, like, I showed a chart about world in progress, I'm talking about this very macro meta things, I personally got interested into progress in a very zoomed in micro perspective, sort of the pains I felt. And I've been thinking about it for 5 years now. And Patrick and sort of Tyler's article started a moment, but this was sort of in my mind for a while. And the way I looked at it, the number one thing for me is engineering progress at the startup I started. Like, we grew from 3 people to 45 in 4 years in terms of engineers, and all of us thought about progress differently. We had these micro trends of, there was this core group that produced most of the patents within the company, and it was this group of 5 guys. And even when we became 80, it's the same group, while we have very smart engineers across the board. And I was like, why is this so localized exactly to that sort of group? The other thing was, and this is well discussed in management science, around onboarding. Like, we started onboarding more people, and it started to take, when we were 3 or 4 people, it was very fast. And then the moment you hit 20 or 25 people, it almost takes a month for them to become productive. And I was like, okay, what is going on here? Like, why can't we be faster about it? Why do we have different vantage points across it? The second thing, which I don't know if you guys have felt, but I felt like we have specialized tooling for everything. I mean, there's Docs and there's Jira and there's Chat. There's like 1 million apps for every special thing. And I'm not sure if that's making us more productive. You're actually just being jerked around 50 places and people are busy for the sake of it. And I don't know if you really measured the amount of time we spend just context switching instead of getting stuff done, there seems to be a big gap. At least that's how I felt it. Then the other thing is, and this was something that occurred to me, because even before, when I got out of school and I started working at App Dynamics, and then my current startup, every patent that I've filed, and I've done 5 or 6 of them, and every piece of work that was interesting at the company actually came from knowledge diversity. Like I have been inspired about stuff from different domains, and that led me to build this really cool feature. Like we have this, and I won't go into tech details about it, but we have building this ML runtime, which is almost like self-instrumented and points out if there's a pain point yourself. And this was completely inspired from stuff I read about the nervous system and biology. And we actually have a working patent and a product developed, but the whole inspiration is from another field. And I felt like as I looked at more people, when we really made interesting work, it was actually inspired from multiple domains. And finally, the other thing that bothered me is the duplication of work with very specialized silos that get formed. To give you a concrete example, we built a little tool at our company when we started, and then as we grew, there was another team that needed something very similar, and then they use a completely different tool while the semantics needed were the same. I have a friend who is a biologist, and he needed some data processing and a simple task, which for me is a weekend exercise because it seemed so simple, but from his perspective, this was going to take a couple months. And similarly, when I look at his work, it feels like, oh my God, this is so complicated. While because he's in that domain, it seemed like super simple. So all of these themes, like personally, from a very narrow lens, bothered me for almost 4 and 5 years. And the recurring theme for me was specialization. And that's kind of the main point so I then said, okay, am I just feeling this because I've been doing this, or is there a trend around here? So then I took on the task of actually going ahead and researching aggressively around what the big question, which is this: is specialization a real thing? And does hyper specialization in society cause more fragmentation, which is leading us to not make progress? And is it inevitable? Can we do something different about it? Because if you look at even people, it's aggressively specialized in all kind of ways. And what I want to share with you guys today is sort of, I've read about 70, 80 research papers around that. There's not a lot of research, but I think I covered almost all the ground that's available. I stood corrected on some things in terms of my intuition and feeling around this, but mostly I found so much evidence that actually held this intuitions to be more true than false. And I'm about to share those things with you guys. So it turns out specialization is actually very real. And the reason we are getting so specialized as a society is because of this concept of burden of knowledge. And what does that mean? So Benjamin Jones is a very popular researcher in the Kellogg School of Management, and he calls this the death of the Renaissance man, where they did a lot of research of many years. And the point they're trying to make is we're getting extremely specialized as a society, especially in the industry. The age at which somebody produces the first innovation is actually getting super high. In fact, research teams and any amount of teams have quadrupled in the 20th century. And over time, between 1970s to 2000s, the field intersection between all the top companies was actually higher than after 2000. So if you look at patents from different companies that are filing these patents, or researchers that are filing patents, the distance between fields is actually reducing. They're getting more and more specialized. And that all points to, because there's just so much material to cover, because we have this burden of knowledge. And he points out this very extremely interesting charts where you can see the trend where the age at first innovation is growing higher and higher. In fact, if you look at data from inventors in Europe, the average age of the first inventor was 37. It's 47 now, because you just have so much education. PhDs take a longer time. The number of people that could cross jump between fields was a lot more higher in the 1920s and then 80s, and now it's actually significantly dropping. And there's just larger and larger teams required to get anything done. So what does this mean? What's happening if you look at, and there's tons of research apart from the ones I highlight, I'm trying to give you the insights around that, that any frontier pushing innovation, stuff that really is groundbreaking, as you would call it, is actually getting extremely harder. and we're actually slowing down. Since 1980s, we haven't really attacked some big ticket items. And the reasons that some people have talked about in research, and again, a couple researchers talked about saying we're too focused on a few areas in science, and everything else is not getting the amount of attention it should get. And just because we're spending more amount of money and resources doesn't mean we're making a lot of progress. Um, and there are a few, and then the counter arguments are, what about AI and CRISPR and gene therapy? But all of those things are in its nascent stage, and we've been actually talking about these things for a long time. If you look at the research, the first time these things appeared, it's almost more than 50, 60 years ago, and I still don't have any drug which that I can take today which has some genetic therapy to it. And in general, when I describe the pain and aspiration driven innovation, mostly, even if you look at the VC world and investment, we're very focused on pain driven innovation. Like, what's the problem we are trying to solve? And very less aspirational. And that's actually more true than ever today, right now. And to actually show this with data, so again, the most popular research around that is Ben Jones, again, with different collaborations. And what this chart is trying to show is they did this super deep study where they took agriculture, technology, a particular company, or actually a couple of companies. They took molecular science, which is basically new drug discovery, and a couple other fields, and concluded that across, and this is the aggregation across all those studies, and I'll show you a specific chart about drug discovery, is that if you see, we're adding a lot of dollars in terms of funding on research everywhere in industry and academia. There are more number of research, but the amount of research productivity we're getting is actually dipping significantly. We are actually not getting the return on investment on the research we're doing. And research productivity is measured by the number of people who are doing research or creating innovation versus the number of interesting ideas that have come up. And sort of the division of those two variables is what research productivity is measured at in these research papers. And there's a huge amount of dip. Here's another interesting chart specifically for new molecular entities. So over time, even though we have putting a lot more effort, we've not added those many drugs back into the market. And then you can argue there's a lot of reasons around regulations and people's narrowed mindset. But it has, if you go deeper down into the research, it comes back again to more and more around specialization. Which then after, like, and again, I just gave you a glimpse. There's tons of more research. If anybody's interested, I can actually point to you everything that leads to this discussion. There's this extreme amount of specialization, which led me to think, okay, how did we make so much progress in the past? Because if you look at the time from 1860s to almost 1970s, where like we started from the steam engine to the internet, we made a lot of progress. And that chart that I showed in the beginning is validation for that. And so how did we do this in the past? Like, what was so special about these Renaissance men and women? So what I did is I tried to look at them, and I looked at all of these and even some more, about like 50 or 60 top innovators in the world who've created stuff that has moved the needle in the society. And if you look at all of these guys and you try to figure out, okay, what's really common about their background? Let's look at all of their work and figure out what happened. The only one insight you get is they were actually polymaths, almost all of them. And most of their work and inspiration was at intersection of different fields. Like today, we love to label people like, you are a CEO and you are a dentist and you are a programmer and you are a data scientist. Like the amount of division and categorization we have is crazy. And that mental model has also led for people to just specialize in narrow areas again. Like, how do you even put like Newton in a particular category? Like he had inventions and work across like 50 domains if you were to really categorize as we do today. And so the common theme that supported at least this gut feeling I had, where I went through all of this research around specialization and concluded that it's really that we are getting extremely specialized. So then I said, okay, this is the past. What about now? Like, what about the very, very top researchers and inventors today? And are they deep specialists as well? And it turns out that is not the case. So this is the latest research done in 2018 by Clarivate Analytics, and they picked data over a decade from 2006 to 2016, and they picked the top 1% of the most highly cited researchers across all these fields. And all these fields are well known to everybody, so I'm not going to repeat that. And first of all, the top 1% is already a very high bar, or for being top 1% for over a period of 10 years. And for the first time in 2018, they introduced a category called crossfield, where you have researchers who've actually made a significant top 1% research contribution to more than one field. Like, you can already start to imagine how hard this must be. But if you really look at the numbers, that's 35%. And that's actually a pretty large number of the best of our researchers actually working cross field. Now, you can argue, I mean, I feel that's not true for most of the society, but the best of the very best are actually intermingled. And the great thing they did in this study was actually go talk to these 6,078 research scientists and inventors and ask them what motivated them, which most of other studies have actually not done. And the number of people that said it was cross pollination of different domains, or their insights and inspiration from different domains, actually influenced them a lot more. So if you really look at the top percent of researchers and innovators, it turns out that they were actually a lot more cross-discipline than not. And so I went down this rabbit hole and tried to do more research around that. And every single detailed paper around trying to analyze all the patents data for over 50 years, every research that any amount of management science people have done boils down to this single fact. There is almost 100% agreement on this, apart from some anomalies, that broad knowledge diversity across individuals actually creates or breeds more innovation, and actually thus value creation in the world. And if I look at the knowledge diversity of people, and there was another study which I want to highlight here that did a great job of saying, okay, let's take a bunch of the best patents that have been filed for 20 years, and let's take the R&D awards over a decade. And there's this award that is given to the best researchers. It's called R&D 100. And let's try to analyze their data. And again, the same point was concluded that knowledge diversity is highly correlated with inventions. But the key point I want to highlight here, which, and you can actually go down and read this if you're interested, that knowledge diversity of every single individual matters. So today, even like we're in tech and we have this idea that we should be super diverse. And so let's get people from 5 different specialization, organize them into a group, and now we have diverse team and they can produce stuff. For the best work ever done with data, this guy proved that diversity of the individual is the highest indicator and not diversity of the group. So you can't compensate the knowledge broadness of a single individual with saying, let's get 6 people of different domains and get them to work together. It actually does not work. So the point that I'm again trying to highlight here is that the significance of each individual's knowledge diversity matters a whole lot in terms of actually making progress. And if you are trying to build stuff, you're trying to work at startups, I think this is a key insight to remember, because it actually almost pushes you to know more about different things and know less and get more specialized. This was around research and patent people who file patents. And I was like, okay, let me look at entrepreneurs, right? People who create modern businesses. Maybe it's more relevant to everybody. And I found this great study, and it's been repeated at least 3 times, but the best one in terms of data collection and not having too many holes in their data is by this people, where they took all the people who started businesses from Kellogg or Harvard Business School, and they measured, okay, we are giving them deep specialized entrepreneurship education. And then you measure, okay, what's the likelihood that they will actually go ahead and start a company or work at a startup? And the signal was like super high. If you gave people, which was successful from their measurement, because they said, okay, well, we're going to teach people more to start companies, hence more companies got started. That's wonderful. But then over time, they went back to the same research and say, okay, now after 15 years, let's analyze which company, which of those people were the most successful. And when it came down to wealth creation and economic returns, the people who were actually more broad and diverse actually ended up doing the best, and by a huge amount. And just because you have more companies doesn't mean you're doing better. And this goes back to my old point that I was trying to make, that progress has to be measured on its outputs, and not, yes, you optimize the inputs, but it's the outputs that matter. So, and by broad education, it's like the people that had the wealthiest entrepreneurs who were pushed out of these schools and then started companies were one people who interned at an NGO or took 50% of their classes outside the business school, or maybe traveled more. And those were the ones who created startups that were actually more successful and created the most amount of wealth. So am I saying that then we should all become hyper generalist and at the cost of going deep in other domain? Because I've been making a strong case for broad domain diversity. And so I tried to take unbiased look at it and said, okay, let me go now take an exclusive live on people who argue where specialization is actually good and whatever is happening in society is actually perfect. And it turns out what I found, that specialization plays an important role, but in the context of sort of once you pick a domain, the incremental discovery within the domain, going deeper or identifying problems within the domain and bubbling it up for others, or sort of a continuous refinement phase. So being specialized in some area is not bad because it helps in these cases. But even for the people who argue for specialization, and my next slide will probably show this there, actually turns out that yes, it's useful, but really the diversity of knowledge across domains is the one that actually solves problems. So the pro specialization argument really has this one central theme, that deep domain expertise and this going like extremely deep into a field is needed because you can find anomalies within that field. And otherwise, other people cannot discover the anomalies and stuff that's not working out within the domain, and which helps to find these openings that will lead to breakthroughs. And this is where I think I felt like I stood corrected on my deep bias against specialization, where I felt, okay, there is a valid point around here that you need to go deeper into that definition. But I'm like, we have a society where things are extremely polarized today. So I want to like take a stance on what my definition of generalist and specialist is, where when we say specialized, when we say this person is an expert in physics, that's how we label that person, and that's the end of it. What I mean by generalist here is not like, you know, a VC who's saying, okay, I look at pitches across 50 domains, so I'm an hyper generalist. Not that, but generalist in the terms that you at least have a hands-on, working, scrappy knowledge of things outside one domain, and where you could still focus on one area but could be still sort of have your tentacles across a couple more domains. And that's and sort of a working knowledge, not that you'll get a Nobel Prize for it, but at least have more knowledge apart from one domain. And there's only 3 people that have argued for specialization being good, like that's the best thing. And there's a couple names and that research around there where say, so far I've been talking like this recombination of knowledge across domains is useful, and this is the only research that says it's actually not good. But then when I actually dug more deeper into it, what I found was they still say that broad recombination is not good, but local recombination is okay. And what that essentially means is that if you're in the field of engineering, anything within engineering is okay, but you're not driving some inspiration from physics. Well, that's also pretty broad in terms of how much discovery we've made. So I don't quite buy that argument that, like recombination is not good, because they themselves say recombination is actually good, but just more localized. Then the other thing was, this study does not account for the people who produced the novel cognitive innovation. What was their background? Like, how did they get inspired? It's mostly about the work they produced. And again, it focuses only on one very narrow domain of nanotechnology. So like the whole research is just focus on the domain of nanotechnology and derive this insight. while everything else that I've talked about in other research is extremely broad across domains. So I buy the argument less, even less. And then at the end, they actually even proved with their data that the top 1% of people who they recognize as the most cognitive inventions that produce an economic return was actually more around the people who had broader recombination of those core ideas that started from specialists, but then later were like mixed with other ideas. And that's the one that produced the returns. So in all, to conclude, with the question that I started and sort of this rabbit hole I went around, for me, the answer is yes. Extreme specialization and the fragmentation actually is leading to a lack of progress. So I'm calling for people to go across domains, people to learn a little bit more, because apart from this basic intuition, we actually have people figuring out that things are helpful when you go across domain. And I think in terms of some quick solutions around that, one thing I already mentioned, I think we need better semantic tooling and making cross-domain information flow working better as well, in my opinion, and actually augmenting memory and intellect better, because I think it helps in terms of in order to make people go more cross domain, you need these pieces of information in terms of tooling to let them learn better. How can I provide and make progress around tooling so people can learn across domains better? Because if there is so much deep knowledge and burden of knowledge is true, then we need to find better abstractions to make knowledge more explicable and also accessible to people. And sort of that's my take on specialization and progress. Real quick, I want to talk about the second thing around hacking progress. And this is more based on the speed and productivity argument, where I want to talk about a practical experiment I did from product. And this is not innovation and invention, but how can you make things more productive? So here's the problem. When we started onboarding new people and we hit over 20 engineers, of course, getting them productive took a lot more time. And we were really wondering why it takes so much time for people to get productive. And so, okay, let's establish success criteria on what it means to be productive, and in terms of our own sense. And our success criteria was the follows. You should be able to run a couple of demos. You should do a meaningful bug fix. You can explain the runtime architecture of the product to other people, and you can actually articulate what you want to do. And if that was the success criteria, how can we make this better? So here's the chart. So what I did, just to explain this chart real quick, is after we hit 20 engineers, I created this onboarding program that we incrementally improved over time in terms of content. And every time 2 to 5 engineers would take the program, I would keep data on how much time it took them to checkbox each of those things and summarize that and just average the amount of time they took, just for simplicity. And if you see here, we've gone all the way from 4 weeks to 1.5 weeks today in terms of how much time it takes for people to hit productivity. And over time, we added, this is very contextual to us in terms of improving the onboarding material. And it seems like obvious now after having done it and sort of in retrospect, but if you look at most companies doing that, there's a little attention paid to this. And the amount of time you can save when you can get people more productive faster is actually very useful. So I would say, like, sort of the people who are interested in progress studies, that we should actually all form these little experiments and share more data around that, even if it's groups we create on Slack or set up initiatives that are helpful. Even if they're narrow, I think it will help in terms of improving the speed and productivity across different places. And there's a bunch of data we can share with each other. And then finally, I want to make the case for intelligence augmentation around tooling, because I feel like this is sort of the main thing around which we can make this is a key important element in which we need to make progress in order to make people more specialist to generalist. And you need better tooling and collaboration across domains, make better cross-domain information explicable to people. And if you look at all of the tooling, I would say we need to invoke some of these older researchers and try to think about how we can improve the knowledge. Because if you really look at all of the tooling that we use today, like the input output modalities are very complex. You can't summarize over pieces of information that you've read very quickly. And the context switch across 50 things is like super, super large. And this causes a problem because there's like as you even try to get more knowledge diversity, even as an individual, there's like 50 things you can go over. And the note taking or the other tooling that we have doesn't quite help you in terms of saying, okay, let's form these insightful connections and the material comes through. The input output, like even if you have a bunch of notes, sometimes you want to search and get an event timeline of the information. Sometimes you would like a quick video. Sometimes you would say, it's easy if I got a TLDR about all this material. And sometimes you actually want to find all of these documents that you might have found about a particular domain. And none of these things sort of quite add up together in a meaningful way. So I'm still working on this, and I sort of have a hazy feeling, but I'm actively exploring intelligence augmentation and what we can do in terms of building tools and products around that. So if anybody's interested in this space in terms of tools of thought or intelligence augmentation, I'd love to talk to anyone interested around that. And there's a lot of interesting stuff which is done by a couple of researchers or people even in the industry today. And if you're interested, we can chat more. So I think that is towards the end of my talk. I want to thank a couple people here. Ray, who's here. Ray, if you can raise your hand. She's Director of Community and Content at Unusual. She really helped put this together. Thank you, Ray. Kathy, who's back there, she's an executive assistant to Jyoti Bansal. She helped set up this space. And Ronil, who is not here, is the guy who helped set this up. So I think we wouldn't have had this event without these guys and their help. So thank you very much. We also have, if anybody's interested, since this talk was hosted by Unusual Ventures, we have Jordan sitting in the back. Jordan, raise your hand. And if you are interested in progress studies, you can talk to me. If you're working on an interesting startup, you're interested in talking about intelligence augmentation, you can talk to me. Or if you're just working on any startup and you would like to connect with Unusual, you can talk to Jordan. And that's it. I think we're sort of running a little over time, so we can do Q&A at the end, unless there are some quick questions. That's my Twitter handle. That's my website. If you want to discuss more around that, we can do later. And with that, that's all I had for today. Next